Okay, so if you're a type 1 and you're struggling with a drug or alcohol problem, this video is for you. You know, recently I heard on this podcast that I listened to called Typology, which is a really good podcast, by the way. You should definitely check it out. It's all about Enneagram types. Anyways, I was listening to this podcast and the guy, Ian Cron, I think is his name, that's the guy on the podcast, he was talking about how type 1s, although they have such strong integrity and morals and boundaries and they work so hard all the time to stay in the lines, that a lot of times they have it, he called it this secret trap door, where type 1s have this strange ability to have this total dual life going on. And his theory about it was that type 1s try so hard to suppress all of those sort of biological, animalistic urges and desires that those things can be pushed down so far they can manifest in other ways, almost in this secret other life kind of way. Now, I had never really heard it put that way, but it made a lot of sense to me. You know, type 1s are so self-disciplined all the time and they're so hard on themselves all the time. And they just plain don't give themselves room for error at all. And so it would make sense to me, like when they fall, they really fall. So it's not uncommon for you to find someone who can be a leader or in a position of power and all of a sudden it comes out there's all this scandal. Oftentimes that's a type 1 that's fallen through the trap door. Now, in my experience with working with type 1s that are struggling with substance use disorders in therapy, in the beginning, you guys are way difficult. And the biggest reason is because it's really, really, really hard for type 1s to admit that they've done something wrong or even made a mistake, even little things. So to admit that you've been wrong and made a huge, ginormous mistake of like getting addicted to drugs or alcohol, that's pretty big. So type 1s usually come in the gate pretty defensively. I mean, they can come in with the armor up. And they'll oftentimes deflect off of themselves and the things that they've done or the things that they're working on by nitpicking about every little thing that's going on in the counseling office or in the group or in the program. They'll fixate on those little details as a way to not deal with themselves, as a way to not see the big giant problem that's going on inside of them. Now, a big reason for that is because deep down inside, type 1s feel like if you've made a mistake or you've done something wrong, that you're not worthy. So for type 1s to admit they've made a mistake, it's a whole different ballgame than for other types because it really goes to the core of who they are. And it feels like if I've made this one mistake, that I'm totally corrupt or evil in general. And that's just not true. So if you're a type 1 and you're watching this video, the quicker that you can admit that you have a problem and forgive yourself and maybe forgive some of the people around you, the quicker you're going to get better. Now, even though I find type 1s to be kind of difficult coming in the gate from therapy, once they do this, once they have this shift, it's like they turn a corner and then they become their regular type 1 self and they start doing everything that you tell them to do and they're following orders and they're doing recovery by the book. It's like they're the teacher's pet of recovery. So once they turn that corner, they often do really well. And they really embrace the ideas and the boundaries and the rules and the concepts of recovery quite well because it actually does fit well within their framework. It's really just that hump of admitting, hey, I made some bad decisions here. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about my personal experience with dealing with these type 1s in therapy. You're not going to find this in the books or podcast or anything, but I usually say, if I find myself in, this is what I call a therapy fist fight with a client, which isn't like a real fist fight, but more like a back and forth argument, like I find myself getting real mad and angry and we're going back and forth, then that's an indicator I am dealing with a type 1 because I'm not very power struggling. But those dang type 1s, especially when they're defensive, they will come at you sharp and they'll say some mean things and I'll hit my button and I'll find myself going back and forth. And I can think of some type 1s I've worked with in the past where, boy, we would just go head to head and just lock up. But you know what's interesting? Like the next day, they would come right around the bend and before you know it, we'd be seeing eye to eye and we'd be back on track. Now, a lot of times these power struggle situations can happen with type 1s because a lot of the so-called rules of recovery are kind of gray and more philosophical in nature and less black and white. And it really really requires you to have some flexible thinking on how to apply that to your life. I can remember this one time I was working with this young guy who's a type 1 who I had worked with for a really long time and had a good relationship with. And he was in our IOP program, that's intensive outpatient program. And he was in there for, I don't know, maybe like 10 weeks. He was doing really well. He was going to meetings. He was participating. He was passing drug screens. And he said to me, hey, when do you think I can graduate? And this was in like our individual session. And I said, I don't know, you're doing pretty good. Let me see how many weeks you've been here. And I looked and I was like, well, you've been here like 10 weeks. Like 16 is the minimum to graduate. I think maybe what you need to focus on these last few weeks is this and this and this. And I gave him some, I don't even remember what, but some kind of little task. And he got so angry with me. And he said, I'm doing better than everyone else in that group. And I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. And why am I not getting to graduate? I mean, he just lost it. And then, I mean, he got pretty nasty. And then I said something like, you know what? This is beginning recovery. This is like kindergartenness of recovery. You need to get out there and get to some meetings and learn real recovery. And then he says something to me like, oh, I've been in meetings and those are old people with problems that I can't relate to about their wives and their jobs and stuff, and that's ridiculous. And then I say something along the lines of, well, you better get in there and listen to those old people because they got something you don't got. They got recovery, and you better figure out how they got it. And you can just imagine this whole thing goes back and forth. But don't worry, it all ends well. That was several years ago, and I still talk to this young fella, and he is doing remarkably well. And these days, we look back on that and laugh. And that wasn't the only therapy fist fight we got into. There were a couple more. But we really had a strong relationship, so no matter what happened, we kind of had that bond. We got through it, and all ended well. In fact, that young man is very close to graduating from medical school. So as you can see, he really turned it around. And he did eventually graduate the program, with honors, of course.